Welcome, everybody. Hi, Happy New Year. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5, the discussion. We will have another person on, technical support person, who will give you the links to where you can access the webinar afterwards. And they are just linked to our, they're archived on our website, so they're easy to find. And this, which will include this webinar and others. And the person, when they get on, they can help you with any kind of non-content related questions, technical questions. Okay, so let's get started. Yeah, this is Chapter 5, which is the discussion, which is typical for the 5-chapter dissertation model. There are different models, sometimes 6 or 7 chapters, and they're just kind of divided up a little differently. So if that's your case, I mean, this really just kind of corresponds to the discussion chapter, whatever chapter that happens to be. Again, the typical structure is the 5-chapter model. Okay, so you're going to hear me say this now, and you're going to hear me say it several times throughout the presentation. Always get your school's template or guidelines if you don't have it already, for the dissertation, for the chapters, because that's what your professors will look at when they, when they go over your chapters to see if what you're doing adheres to their guidelines. And sometimes, even though this will serve as a good kind of standard, fairly typical, guide for the typical features of a discussion, sometimes schools have their own, their little things they want that may be slightly different. Maybe they want the headers, different name for the headers, or they want the headers in a different order or something. So again, always kind of default to your your school's template, or if they don't have one, ask your chair for, a good example, a sample from your school of an approved dissertation. And those are also available. You can access those through your school library, and ProQuest publishes all approved dissertations, so you can look there. Okay, but this will act as a good kind of general guide. So moving on, here's what we're going to cover today. These are the typical features, typical sections, the introduction, interpretations of the findings, also sometimes called the discussion, which I know it's discussion within the discussion chapter, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, and a summary. Okay. So the introduction, like all introductions, what you really want to do is just reorient your reader. Just kind of remind them of maybe the purpose of your study, remind them why your study, it was important to conduct your study, why it was needed, maybe remind them of the research problem. And if you want to, you can preview, contents of the chapter that will follow. But again, look at your school's template if they want something a little different. Be sure to include that. Sometimes you can include like a brief summary of the findings at the end of the introduction. Okay, the interpretations of the findings section. This is really the kind of the heart of the chapter. Because everything follows from this. So when you make conclusions later in the chapter, or you make recommendations for practice, or you make recommendations for further research, everything follows from your interpretations. So what does it mean to interpret your findings? I mean, this is where I think people kind of get a little, if not confused, they're really not sure what that means. It's not kind of like it sounds, where you just kind of can give your own interpretation, or your own spin on the findings. So what you're really doing, what they mean is you're relating what you found to the findings of previous research in the area. And then depending on how your findings are situated within that previous research, you can make interpretations and conclusions based on that. Whether your findings, they might support previous research, they might differ. If previous findings are inconclusive, your findings may come down on one side as opposed to the other. So the idea here in this section is to discuss your findings as they relate to the findings of previous literature. So for organizing the section, it's always a good idea, first of all, to organize the section, because it helps you as a writer to organize material and organize your thoughts. And it's also reader friendly, right? So you don't have just kind of a big chunk of text in the section, and you're trying to kind of like cover all the findings at once. It gets difficult, and it's easy for you as a writer to get lost. And if you're lost, then your reader's going to be lost when they're reading it. So a good way to break it down to subsection this section out is to make headers based on your research questions. If your study was quantitative, if your study was qualitative, you could make headers based on your themes. So the idea here would be to restate research question 1, for example, or theme 1. Describe your findings, summarize your findings, and you don't need, this is not a statistics heavy chapter, right? The statistics were back in chapter 4, or the results chapter. So this is kind of a really plain spoken chapter. You can add, some of the important statistics to help reinforce, when you're summarizing your findings if you want, but you don't need a lot of statistics here. Again, that's if your study is quantitative. But so research question 1 or theme 1, lay out what you found, summarize what you found. And then the idea is to bring in research, findings of previous research in the area, major findings from your chapter 2, right? So here's what you found for RQ1 or theme 1. How does that relate to what previous studies have revealed? You found this. Well, Smith, found something else, or your findings confirm what Smith found. So you want to, it's important to say whether your findings are confirming previous research or if they're not confirming previous research, they're not supporting. Let me, I also meant to say too, for questions, I will get to them at the end. I'm not referring to any book. I'm referring to your chapter 5 and findings, relating your findings to the findings of previous literature from the chapter 2. So anyway, but I will get to your questions at the end, but if you want to type them in so you don't forget them into the question and answer box, that's fine. But I'll get to them at the end. Yes, they will be. And if my support person doesn't get on before we leave, I will give you the URL for where we archive the webinars on our website. Okay, so moving on. So you research question 1 or theme 1, whatever, if it's quant or qual, summarize it, bring in research from the chapter 2 on what you found, noting whether your findings support previous research or they don't support previous research, set up a discussion that way. If your findings support previous research, then you can make conclusions based on that, right? Then whatever you studied, that's the basis for a firm conclusion. If your findings don't support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness. And it's usually expected that you you try to briefly explain why your findings may have been different. Sometimes it has to do with your population or your setting. differences in that as compared to previous research. But some kind of explanation of why your findings may have been different. So you wash, rinse, and repeat for the next RQ or the next theme. Okay, you just follow that kind of structure in this discussion section. So for research 1, research question 2, research question 3, or however many themes you have, just subsection them out by themes. Okay. All right, and that's really the idea of this section. It's going to be specific to what you found. It's going to be specific to your study. But that's the idea, relating your findings to previous literature, setting up a discussion, breaking it down by research question or by theme if it's qualitative. If it's mixed, if you have a mixed methods design, do you need to do this for quantitative and qualitative? It depends. Usually for mixed methods, usually you have a quantitative portion, and usually the qualitative portion is to kind of help get extra information, or to to get information that sheds light on the quantitative portion. So sometimes you don't have kind of themes for the qualitative portion. So it just kind of depends on what makes sense as you go along. Sometimes you can do what I just described for the quantitative portion, then have a kind of a discussion of the qualitative portion and how that relates to the quantitative portion above. I mean, that's if it's mixed, if mixed methods design. Okay. Like I said, that's really the heart of the discussion chapter. Your limitation section, this is where you note or explain any shortcomings or weaknesses that may have affected your results. A good place to start for this is go back to your chapter 1 or your chapter 3, because somewhere in your proposal, you probably talked about potential limitations, like limitations, like, forecasting what may have been limitations before you started. So go back to what you said and see if what you said actually were limitations. Those things actually became limitations as you move forward. And limitations are not really challenges. Like if you had a challenge, but you met the challenge, that's not really limitations, because it didn't, excuse me, it didn't really affect anything. Now, like, so if something happened where you couldn't get the data that you wanted, or like, a data set, you couldn't get it, you had to use a different data set, that would be a limitation, because it has a potential to change things. Sometimes with COVID now, we're still dealing with that. I mean, that sometimes throws a wrench in the gear of, getting participants or getting access to certain things. So anything that kind of, may have affected your results, you want to mention it in the limitation section. You also want to discuss the generalizability of your results to the larger sample population. So in other words, what you found, will it transfer, generalize well to the larger study population? Usually if your study is quantitative and you had a sufficient number of participants, chances are your findings should generalize pretty well, especially if you use like random sampling, which is more representative of the sample, the larger sample, than something like convenient sampling, just using people because you have access to them, or you know them some way. Those things can affect the generalizability of your findings. Also, if you've done a qualitative study, this is worth mentioning. The findings of qualitative studies are not designed to generalize well, because by nature and by design, qualitative studies have low sample sizes. right? Because you're usually interviewing people. You can't interview 80 people, right? So you're usually interviewing 8, 10, 12, 15 people. So you have a low sample size specifically to get in-depth information that you can't get with large quantitative samples. So it's worth explaining that if you have a qualitative study that your results are not going to generalize well, but they're not designed to. They're designed to, the study's designed to get in-depth information. Although now that can shed light and insight onto whatever it is you're studying, but it's different than generalizability. Okay. So, we conduct studies for certain reasons. I mean, the information that you get has value. And these next two sections, implications for practice and recommendations for further research, is kind of like talking about the value of the information that you got, right? So, and it's for two areas. It's for practice and it's for research. So based on what you found, and this is just like it sounds, what are the implications for people at the level of practice for what they do? How can the information that you got inform what people do at the practical level? So if you've conducted an education study, your findings may have implications for teachers, for administrators, maybe even for students. It just depends on what you studied and what kind of study you did. But so this is a time to, to get kind of specific. You can get real nuts and bolts and specific. I mean, does it mean that, for example, teachers need more professional development? This is just an example. If they do, what form could that take? Could it be, increased funding for things like conferences? Could it be, more training sessions, on-site kind of professional development, workshops, things like that. So implications for practice can get specific, right? And they should be linked to what you found. Okay. And recommendations for further research. This also has value, right? It gives us your findings have contributed to the research. They've contributed to the literature. They've told researchers something. So based on what you found, what can you recommend for further research? Recommendations should be based specifically on your findings. They shouldn't be general recommendations. And they can sometimes be based on your limitations. So recommendations based on your findings. So any finding that is new or novel or unexpected, you can certainly recommend further research on that. Research that does not agree or support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness. So you can recommend more research on that. Recommendations based on limitations. The idea is, if you had a limitation that may have affected your findings or your results, the idea is to recommend replicating your study, but that future researchers address whatever limitation there was about your study. For example, if you conducted a quantitative study and you had a low sample size, which can be a major limitation for quantitative studies, you can suggest that the study be replicated and that the researchers just ensure that that the sample size is adequate. You can also recommend different kinds of studies, different types of studies, and different designs to get different kinds of information. If you do that, you should probably explain what kind of information or why it would be important to get that kind of information. So for example, if you want to know more about a topic or a phenomenon or something, you could recommend maybe a case study. I mean, if you didn't conduct one, obviously, you could recommend a case study. Case studies have multiple data sources. So they give us a kind of more comprehensive view of something because they have these multiple data sources. You know, you can if you're studying some kind of process, you can recommend that it be studied with a longitudinal study, and that longitudinal study is a study that has multiple data collection points over time, which is good to kind of apprehend, you know, the dynamics of something or how process plays out over time. So, and if you say you conducted a quantitative study and you found a relationship between two things that was unexpected, you could recommend digging deeper into that with a qualitative study. So you can recommend different kinds of studies too to get different kinds of information. Okay, summary. Check your school's template. Summaries are sometimes optional. Some schools will let you just end after the recommendations for research. Some schools want a summary. If your school does want a summary, remember it's kind of a chapter summary, but it's also a summary of your study. So like a standard summary, just recap major points from the chapter, but also because it is the end of your dissertation, you know, leave the reader with a take-home message. And what that means is, you know, what are the most important insights or the most important findings or the most important points about your study that you want the reader to remember, you know, and on a kind of a strong positive note, and kind of, you know, sell your findings, right? One more thing I didn't talk about, I'm going to go back to it. Interpretations of the findings, which again is largely about discussing your findings in relation to the findings of previous literature. We also need to talk about theory a little bit, or your theoretical framework, or your theoretical foundation, or your conceptual foundation. Where do you put that, right? Where does the discussion of the theory go, right? So there's kind of two ways to handle that. As you are discussing your findings in relation to previous findings, if your theory, you can kind of, if it makes sense to weave your theory into those discussions, do so. And it doesn't mean that you have to, you know, for every RQ or every theme, you have to insert your theory. But if there are obvious places where it would work to discuss your theory, you could do there. Alternately, you could just have a separate section for the theory and call it like links to theory or connection to theory or something, or just have the name of your theory. And then you would have a section where you discuss you know, what you found in relation to the theory. You know, obviously start by briefly reminding the reader of the definition of your theory, what it's designed to do, and then, you know, discuss your findings in relation to the theory. Does the theory explain what you did? You know, do they match up, right? Is the theory kind of appropriate to explain what you looked at? Okay. This is who we are. This is some of our contact information, email, phone number. And again, I'm going to, in a few minutes, I'm going to post where we archive the webinars, including this webinar. Also, just one final tip, you know, use your resources, you know, things like webinars, you know, internet resources, school resources, but also remember that when you sit down to write, it's sometimes having an example of an approved dissertation, you know, that's similar to yours or in the same area from your school. Just having an example or two to look at to see how people have handled some of these sections is a good idea, because you've never done it before, right? It's like anything else that you haven't done before. You know, you can learn and you can learn about it, and that's helpful, but sometimes that only goes so far. You need to see that like concrete example. So that's always helpful too. Okay, I'm going to leave that up. I'm going to answer your questions here in a minute. Let me get our website up here, and I'll post the where the webinars are archived. Yes, give me 1 second here. If you have any questions, you can be typing them in now. That's fine. I'll get to those in a minute. Webinars. Okay. Okay. There is the link for where we archive the webinars. Okay, and not only is this one there, but there's also other webinars, and we do run other webinars on other topics and other chapters. So just check our website and our calendar for what we're offering when. So this includes, chapter 1, chapter 2, 3, 4, developing, methodologies, things to do with methods and research questions, also things to do with the lit review. So just check and see what we're doing when, and you can pop in for other webinars. Okay, let's go ahead and take some questions here. Will these slides be available later? Yes, I just posted the link for that. Will there be an e-certificate for the training? No, this is not training. There's no certificate. This is just an informational webinar. Not seeing the link. It should be right there. I can repost it. Let me see. It's right in the chat box here. The link is in the chat box. So you may have to open that up to see it. Okay, I can't see it either. I'm not sure why I'm not sure why the link is not showing up in the chat box. I posted it twice. But I do know that if you are registered, that make sure that it's for everyone. Okay. Two hosts and panels. Don't see it. No one sees it. Okay. Two hosts and panels. Let me see. Hosts and panels. Let's see. Everyone. Let me try this. How about now? Awesome. Okay. Hey, it helps when you know how the technology works. Talking to myself, of course. All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for coaching me through that. Okay, great. Now back to questions. Let's see. Okay. All right, it seems like all the questions are about links to that. Okay. Any other questions about what we just covered? You remember when you go through this, I'm sure you know that these chapters, it's a process, right? So when you hand something in, you get comments, right, from your chair and from your people. That's just the way it works. And the game is, or it's not the game, the process is, you address the comments as best you can, work with your chair until there's no more comments. So it does take some persistence and, just kind of sticking with it. Let's see, are themes equal to findings? For qualitative, yes. I mean, for qualitative studies, yes, your findings are in the form of themes, if that makes sense. So, so yes. because for like quantitative, your findings are in the form of statistics, that indicate something is connected to something else or something causes something else. But yeah, for qualitative, your findings take the form of themes. Okay, anybody else? Questions? All right, well, if there's no more questions, I want to wish everybody a happy new year. I want to wish you good luck moving forward. And again, check our calendar for other webinars. We have other webinars on other topics, other chapters. And if you think you might want to talk to somebody about what we offer, free consultation, you can contact us for that too. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care. All right, bye-bye.